and I had an investment background, so I looked at it from a different perspective, and I became concerned, and I did a lot of research over like 4 years, and finally I said, I'm going to write about this because this is really important. And starting in 2010, late 2010, so I've only been writing on this, I had an idea. And my idea, if you heard about the booming corporate profits, and the booming corporate profits of 2009 and 2010, they just came back faster than ever. And this was something that I anticipated years before, and I told people that. I said, the first people who caused this crisis and the first people who did it, they're going to be the first to be bailed out. And so it doesn't take much because it was a pattern that was already established going back 30 years. Whether it was the debt crisis of the developing countries in the early 80s, because Citibank and all the other commercial banks, they were basically what they were pushing loans on people because they had hundreds of billions of dollars in petrodollars. And everyone remembers the supply side inflation from the 70s. So all the money went overseas because we're buying oil now about 6 to 7 times more expensive than only in a decade. So they sent the money back, and the banks invested it because Walter Wriston of Citibank said sovereign countries can't go bankrupt. So they just had junior traders pushing several $100 million loans. And when the interest rates got jacked up with Paul Volcker, it created this, basically, people remember the Illinois Bank, and then, like I said, 1981 was Brazil and Russia, Argentina, and then later you had the savings and loan crisis of the late 80s, and then again, you had the late 90s, you had the long-term capital management crisis, and the Southeastern Asian economies collapsed, again, or 1994, I forgot 1994, Mexico, basically right after NAFTA was passed, Mexico goes into a huge crunch, wages and employment, wages falling dramatically, unemployment skyrocketing as structural adjustment and other programs took their force. So, and the Mexican people didn't get bailed out. It was basically U.S. bankers got bailed out for their loans they did. So it was a pattern that was established, like I said, over 30 years. And then by the 2000, it was the mega bubble of all time, the housing bubble. And
dot-com bubble before that, wasn't it?
Dot-com and then
the dot-com bubble, and there was government intervention to create that, and certainly a lot of regulatory forbearance, which basically means a light touch regulation. Regulatory forbearance is basically, we have the regulations on book, but we're not going to enforce them. That pertains to finance and labor equally. So, I told my friends, this was 2008, I said, watch this. I said, these companies are going to fire people so fast that they're just going to fire people, shift the remaining burden over, you're going to get productivity through the roof, and they're going to crash wages, because when you have high unemployment, that's one of the pillars of neoliberalism. This is this 30-year economic system that only benefits the top 1%. And it's really not a question whether income inequality and wealth inequality have increased in 30 years. As I'm passing out... I passed them out. The Congressional Budget Office, they were commissioned several years ago by the Congress to put together a U.S. income inequality study over the last 30 years. So it's beyond argument that income inequality has risen dramatically. The numbers really kind of don't tell the full story of the pattern that I see. And the pattern is that every time there's a recession, you have massive unemployment and wage stagnation starting in the late 70s. And every time there's a new recovery, it's more and more jobless. And each one looks like the one before it, but a more pronounced version. And that's why the title of my 3-part series is called The Greatest Recovery, because none of these recoveries were characterized by jobs and wages. This is the recovery that Americans have been waiting for. They've been waiting for it the last 3 years. They've been waiting for it the last 30. It's jobs and wages, because for 9.5 out of 10 people, that's what matters. And the unemployment situation, whether it's long-term or short, it doesn't affect just unemployed people. The phrase that I always use, and I will always use it, is that when 1 out of 10 workers are unemployed, the other 9 can't get a raise. And I think when you look at the data over the last 2 years, that's something that the CBO doesn't get into, because whether it's the people that won the John Bates Clark Award, Piketty and Sayaz, they did income inequality, and they've won the economics award for the income inequality, but most people's numbers start at 2007. My work has been basically focused on the 2009 to the present period. And what we're living through right now is the most dramatic and unequal and most lopsided recovery in U.S. history. from mid 2009 to late 2010, Andrew Sum, the labor market professor of Northeastern, he looked into this economy, this recovery from mid 2009 to late 2010. He looked at this recovery. He looked at income inequality. And what he found was staggering. He called it unprecedented in post-war history. In fact, probably unprecedented in 100 years. The 1% in that period from mid-2009 to late 2010 captured 88% of income growth. That's up from about 2/3 from 2000 to 2007, because we've been living through these unequal, lopsided recoveries. That's the theme I'm trying to bring. Whether it's the 80s recovery, whether it's the 90s, whether it's the 2000s, and now there's the new, if you want to call it Obama recovery, the new recovery. These are all, they each presage the one coming next. Each one more jobless, each one more income inequality, each more with endemic unemployment in this phrase of jobless recovery. So in this latest recovery, like I said, it's the most lopsided in U.S. history. 88% of income growth, which was tepid, because it's a recession, right? It's a weak recovery or recession, so it hasn't been that great of recovery. So tepid growth, and of that tepid growth, 88% is going to the top 1%. And those two are completely connected. The slow growth and the income inequality. And that's something that I think gets lost on a lot of people. Because the thesis of my story is basically a bad economy is great for corporate profits. And it's somewhat counterintuitive. Because people say, well, if businesses don't have customers, that's an idiotic statement, Mark. And I say, right. At some point, you're right. But the truth of the matter is that there has been some work done, and it looks like there is a correlation between this slow growth and this increasing inequality. And that's why you don't necessarily see a push, not just for job creation by Washington, but really stimulative measures to boost the economy, whether it's through growth or investment. You don't really see that taking on the fore. I think the New York Times had an article, I think a month ago, and I'll pass it around here because it's the only reason I have it. So this is New York Times, no leftist rag. And it's basically just the story of incomes in the last few years. So you heard the recovery started and the recession officially ended. That was mid-2009. That's just because of the way that economists measure it. They say, well, the recession is 2 consecutive quarters of falling growth, and if you abate that, then you're in a recovery period. But I think that the perspective that economists use for recovery and the definitions they use, as far as, I think they're antiquated.
In the media.
I think, yeah, in the media tends to cite the academics and the economists that are at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and like I said, they just look at straight across economic growth. Declines for 2, you're in a recession. You get out of it, you're basically out of the hole. Now, for workers, it's a different perspective. For them, at the top of their concerns on the economy is, like I always said, jobs and wages. So that if you look at jobs and wages and measure that, you can tell how well have workers recovered. Now, the perspective of corporations, which is something that I have experience from investing for 10 years, is something that I pay very close and particular attention to. And for them, a recovery isn't growth. For them, a recovery isn't jobs, nor is it wages. It's simply profits. And that's why I call it the greatest recovery, because it's been the greatest boom in corporate profits in history. And that makes you wonder for a second. I mean, I don't think it's an uncontroversial definition to say that capitalism is defined as a system of private profit. I don't think that's controversial. So why is it that profits are higher? I mean, you could say that capitalism is doing better than ever, right? But the economy is not. And so that it's a fundamental thing that we've gone so far in the direction of this country that these two things have become confounded. That the health of the economy and the health of capitalism are maybe the two separate things. And if our economy is indeed capitalist, how can they diverge so fundamentally? But like I said, capitalism hasn't had a better 2 years in the last 30 years in its history in America. In this economy generally, from the perspective of workers, or from the standard metrics of economists, investment, productivity, well, no, that's been great because workers are working their tails off. But for most investment and growth metrics, they've been more and more slow and more stagnant. So macroeconomic statistics tell you pretty horrible economy. And then you look at it from the workers' perspective of jobs and wages, worst economy in 80 years, bar none. So capitalism has never done better. The American economy is suffering like never before. I think that's something to keep in mind.